I remember the first time I heard about Harrowgate Inn. It was 1876, and my younger brother Cornelius had just set out on a journey from Philadelphia to Pittsburgh, hoping to find work and make a name for himself in a world still scarred by the Civil War. He was an adventurous boy, barely 20, full of energy and optimism, convinced that the country held more opportunities than dangers, but I had a nagging feeling in my gut from the moment he left. Something about the stories I had heard, the whispers travelers shared in taverns, made me uneasy, and that unease would prove to be the thread that pulled back the curtain on a darkness I could never have imagined. Cornelius wrote to me sporadically, as young men on the move often do, sharing tales of bustling towns, strange inns, and the people he met along the way. In his last letter, which he never sent, he mentioned Harrowgate Inn with glowing praise. The inn, he said, was a refuge for weary travelers. "The Harrogates are the kindest people I have met," he wrote. "Their rooms are warm, the food abundant, and the company reassuring. I've never felt more at home." It was a letter filled with hope, one I would later read with horror, knowing that the words it contained were a carefully constructed mask for something sinister. I can still picture the inn in my mind, even though I never saw it myself. It was a large, sturdy building set on a lonely stretch of road, the kind of place travelers spotted from a distance and immediately considered a sanctuary. Its whitewashed walls and neatly trimmed gardens gave the impression of respectability. The windows, bright and clean, seemed to invite visitors inside, promising warmth and sustenance at the end of a long, exhausting journey. And yet there was something unsettling about the place. Those who walked past it, or even entered its doors, could sense, if only faintly, that something in the air was off. A subtle unease, like the whisper of a warning that went unnoticed until it was too late. When Cornelius arrived, he wrote enthusiastically about Walton and Susan Harrogate, the couple who owned the inn. Walton, he described, was a tall, broad-shouldered man with a genial smile and the kind of easy charm that made strangers feel at ease instantly. He wore his hospitality like a cloak, wrapping guests in reassurance and subtly masking the harsh realities of the world outside. Susan, on the other hand, was smaller, quieter, but possessed a magnetic presence. She moved with a deliberate grace, her hands always busy in the kitchen or at the meat counter, and she had a voice that could soothe or command attention depending on the situation. Together, they were the embodiment of domestic perfection, the ideal hosts every traveler dreamed of encountering. Cornelius spoke often of the meals he enjoyed at the inn, and it's in his letters that I began to notice a curious pattern. He raved about the sausages in particular, describing them as unlike anything he had tasted before, rich, flavorful, and perfectly seasoned. He even speculated that the secret lay in Susan's meticulous care, the way she treated each cut of meat as though it were an art form. "She must spend hours preparing the meat," he wrote. "Every sausage tastes as though it were seasoned with patience and pride." There was a strange reverence in his tone, almost a sense of worship for something as simple as food. At the time, I assumed it was just youthful exaggeration, the kind of hyperbole young men used when traveling. Little did I know, those words would later serve as a chilling testament to horrors I could not yet comprehend. The inn itself was carefully maintained, and I began to piece together through Cornelius's accounts and my own inquiries how carefully the Harrogates orchestrated every detail of their operations. Rooms were cleaned with obsessive precision, meals were served at exact intervals, and the couple took a personal interest in the needs of each guest. Yet beneath the surface of this perfection, there were subtle hints of something deeply wrong. Cornelius mentioned the basement in passing, a place he never ventured into but that Susan sometimes referred to with a glance or an almost imperceptible gesture. There were locked cabinets, keys that were never lent to anyone, and grain sacks stacked neatly in corners that seemed oddly out of place in a working inn. These little details, though seemingly innocuous, began to form the first threads of suspicion in my mind. I also learned from Cornelius that the inn had a number of animals on the property: pigs, chickens, and a few cows, all carefully tended by Walton. Yet the sheer volume of meat Susan produced, especially the sausages, didn't seem to match the number of animals visible in the breeding area. Cornelius hadn't questioned it much, assuming that the Harrogates simply had secrets of their own. But the discrepancy gnawed at me when I began retracing his steps after his disappearance. How could such a small property sustain such extraordinary output? The thought at the time was unsettling but abstract, an intuition I didn't yet know how to articulate. It was the first night at Harrowgate that would have been unforgettable had anyone truly realized the danger lurking there. Cornelius described a hearty dinner, the table laden with roasted meats, bread, vegetables, and Susan's sausages. Walton poured generous measures of his homemade brandy into the cups of each guest, always cheerful, always attentive. Cornelius wrote that he felt safely cocooned in warmth, a description that now strikes me as tragically ironic. Every detail of that dinner, the careful seasoning of the sausages, the precisely measured brandy, the genial smiles of Walton and Susan, would later become evidence of a meticulous plan to lull victims into complacency. From the moment guests crossed the threshold of Harrowgate Inn, they were drawn into an illusion of comfort and security. There was no hint, in the bright dining room or the cozy bedrooms, of the horrors that awaited below. And yet, the Harrogates had spent years perfecting the process, selecting travelers, observing them, and categorizing them based on wealth, social isolation, and perceived vulnerability. Cornelius, like so many before him, had fit neatly into the pattern. His youth, his solitude, and the small valuables he carried made him an ideal target. Looking back now, I realized that the initial charm of the inn was deliberately engineered, a veneer designed to hide something far more sinister. Every act of kindness, every warm smile, every delicious meal served by Susan's hands was part of a calculated strategy. The Harrogates had studied human behavior, understood the value of trust, and weaponized hospitality itself, the very qualities that made them appear benevolent. Attention to detail, generosity, and concern for guests were twisted into tools of manipulation, the first step in a sequence that would lead to unspeakable horrors. The story of Harrowgate Inn begins, then, with trust. Trust given freely by weary travelers, trust extended to strangers on a lonely road, trust placed in the assumption that kindness is genuine. That trust, as I would learn, was exploited with a level of cunning that chilled me to my core. Cornelius's disappearance was only the beginning. The inn, the Harrogates, and the meals they served concealed a methodical system of murder and cannibalism, an operation that had lasted nearly a decade before my persistence forced the truth into the light. And so, as I retraced my brother's final steps, reading his letters and listening to neighbors' memories, I began to realize that the world I thought I knew, the world of simple inns, honest food, and kind strangers, was not as safe as I had believed. Behind every warm smile, behind every plate of food, there was the possibility of something far darker. Harrowgate Inn was more than a house of hospitality. It was a carefully constructed trap, a place where evil hid behind the facade of human kindness, and where an entire community would later learn, with horror, that the most ordinary acts of trust can conceal the unimaginable. And it all began with a sausage. After Cornelius disappeared, I became consumed with the need to understand what had happened. At first, I tried to convince myself that he had merely gone off the grid, exploring towns and meeting people along the way. But as weeks turned into months, the absence of letters became a gnawing void, a quiet terror that refused to be ignored. Something in my heart told me that Harrowgate Inn, which Cornelius had praised so enthusiastically, might not be the sanctuary he believed it to be. The feeling was vague at first, like a shadow at the corner of my vision, but I couldn't dismiss it. I began my inquiries cautiously. The inn was not far from the main road, and some of the local farmers and townspeople had known the Harrogates for years. I spoke with them, pretending to be a traveling merchant seeking lodging, asking about the couple and their inn. Everyone spoke highly of Walton and Susan, almost too highly, as though compelled to protect the inn's reputation. "The Harrogates are fine people," one farmer told me. "They've fed travelers, housed them, and never asked for more than a fair price. Good, honest folk." Yet when I probed further about guests who had left, about missing travelers, or about any odd occurrences, the same people hesitated, looked away, or muttered vague phrases. Something in their evasiveness made my skin crawl. The first real clue came from a seemingly trivial observation. As I walked along the back of the property, I noticed the animals. There were pigs, a few cows, and some chickens, all well fed and healthy. But something didn't add up. Cornelius had described meals of sausage so plentiful and so rich that it seemed impossible they came only from these animals. The breeding pens were small, the numbers of animals low, yet the kitchen churned out enormous quantities of meat products. I asked questions about the supply, casually at first, while pretending curiosity about farming practices. Each time, Susan's answers were evasive. "We manage," she said, smiling sweetly. "It's a gift of organization and care." That answer, simple and polite, felt hollow, as though it concealed a truth that no one wanted to speak aloud. I also noticed the basement door. It was locked, heavy and unremarkable in appearance. Yet the fact that Susan and Walton never allowed anyone near it struck me as suspicious. In a normal inn, guests might occasionally need to retrieve stored goods. But here, the couple seemed to guard that door as though it were a treasure chest or a prison. Cornelius had written nothing about it, perhaps because he didn't think to explore. But in retrospect, his silence felt like a warning. Something in that locked space had captured the Harrogates' obsessive attention, and the way they protected it told me that whatever was inside was valuable, but not in a conventional sense. It was during casual conversations in the local taverns that I began to hear hints from travelers who had stayed at the inn over the years. Some recalled strange smells, unusual for a rural inn. A few mentioned odd noises in the middle of the night, scratching or movement in the basement. Most of these accounts were dismissed as exaggeration or superstition, but patterns began to emerge. Many guests, I learned, simply never returned to their journeys, vanishing without a trace. These were not stories found in newspapers or official records, just whispers exchanged in dimly lit rooms between people cautious about speaking openly. Each story individually could be written off as coincidence, but the accumulation was alarming. As I pieced these fragments together, I decided to focus my attention on the inn itself. If my brother's fate had been sealed at Harrowgate, then he was not the first, and he might not be the last. Something had to be done. It was with a mixture of dread and determination that I contacted the local constabulary, urging a formal investigation. My warnings were initially met with skepticism. Walton and Susan were respected, seemingly law-abiding citizens, and the accusations, disappearances, suspicious behavior, locked basements, sounded almost too strange to be real. But my persistence, combined with the corroborating accounts from other travelers and locals, convinced the authorities to inspect the property. What followed would reveal a reality so horrific, it would shatter the community's sense of safety, trust, and normalcy. The first official inspection was carefully planned. Officers arrived with the intention of conducting a thorough examination of the inn, particularly the basement and storage areas. It was a precautionary measure intended to confirm or dismiss the mounting suspicions. Yet even before the inspection began, Walton and Susan displayed signs of unease. Their smiles were strained, their movements slightly off, as though they were aware that the veil of their perfection was about to be torn away. For the first time, the illusion of normalcy faltered. In retrospect, the signs had been everywhere, small, subtle, and easily rationalized. Locked doors, unusual odors, excessive secrecy in food preparation, unexplained quantities of meat, but no one had connected the dots until it was too late for Cornelius and the others. The Harrowgate Inn, a place celebrated for its hospitality and charm, had been hiding a darkness beneath its surface, and I had unwittingly stumbled onto the first threads that would unravel a decade-long nightmare. The day of the official investigation arrived with a heavy, oppressive feeling. I remember walking to the Harrowgate Inn with the officers, each step crunching on the frost-hardened dirt of the property, the winter sun low in the sky, casting long shadows across the field. Walton greeted us with the same practiced warmth I had seen so many times before, his smile wide, his hands extended as though to welcome old friends. Susan, standing in the kitchen doorway, gave a polite nod, her hands dusted with flour, a faint scent of smoked meat lingering in the air. At first glance, nothing seemed amiss. The inn looked ordinary, almost quaint, a place one might feel entirely safe in. But I knew better. I had felt the unease for months, the gnawing sense that something beyond comprehension lay behind those walls. The officers began by inspecting the more visible areas, the guest rooms, the dining room, and the kitchen. Everything appeared in order. Dishes were clean, floors swept, and the shelves stocked with neatly arranged ingredients. Walton and Susan moved among us as they always did, guiding the investigation with politeness, answering questions carefully, yet their eyes, sharp and calculating, never left the officers' movements. It was a quiet tension, subtle but unmistakable, a silent war of observation. Susan seemed unusually tense when questions arose about the origin of her sausages. "All meat is raised right here," she said, voice measured. "There's nothing unusual in the process. We're very careful to maintain the quality of our products." But when pressed about quantities, she faltered, hesitating as though uncertain how to justify the volume with the few animals visible on the property. That pause, brief though it was, sent a chill down my spine. It became clear to the officers that the real mystery lay beneath the inn, in the basement. The door, once a minor curiosity, had now become the focus of the investigation. Walton reluctantly handed over the key, his hands trembling ever so slightly as he unlocked the heavy wooden door. The hinges creaked as it swung open, revealing a darkness that seemed almost tangible, as though the air itself had been waiting, holding its breath for decades. A faint musty odor escaped, a combination of damp wood, long-stored objects, and something far more unsettling that I couldn't immediately identify. The first light of the officers' lanterns illuminated the basement, revealing grain sacks stacked along the walls. At first it looked ordinary, a simple storage area for flour, grains, and preserved goods. But as the officers began to move the sacks, what lay behind them turned our stomachs. A large chest, old and worn, sat hidden against the far wall. The officers pried it open with gloved hands, revealing dozens of personal belongings, carefully preserved despite the years. Identity papers, letters, coins, jewelry, and other small valuables filled the chest. Among these objects were letters from travelers, unsent notes, and Cornelius's own papers, including a detailed account of his arrival at the inn, praising Walton's hospitality, a chilling contrast to the reality we were now uncovering. The discovery of personal documents was only the beginning. Officers began examining the surrounding soil near the breeding pens and the basement walls. What they found was horrifying. Bone fragments, some partially gnawed, some clearly human. Skulls, long bones, and pieces of ribs emerged from the soil as the officers carefully excavated, their faces pale but determined. I remember the moment they held up the first recognizably human fragment, felt as though the world had shifted beneath my feet. The realization that these bones belonged to missing travelers, people we had once hoped were merely lost or delayed, transformed our understanding of the Harrowgate Inn from one of caution to one of absolute terror. Walton and Susan's demeanor changed dramatically once the evidence became undeniable. Walton, who had been polite and confident moments before, grew increasingly nervous. His hands twitched, his speech became hurried and disjointed. Susan, too, became defensive, her composure fracturing as questions about meat preparation were pressed. She insisted repeatedly that all meat came from animals raised on the property, but could not explain the sheer volume or variety of sausages and cuts found throughout the kitchen. Every lie they attempted to tell crumbled under the weight of physical proof. The search of the basement itself revealed even more unsettling items. Suitcases, bundles of clothing, jewelry, coins, identity documents, and personal mementos were discovered, each belonging to a different person, some adults, some children. Toys, trinkets, and personal letters indicated that entire families had been victims, vanishing from the roads without a trace. The sheer scale of what Walton and Susan had done became apparent. This was not a series of isolated incidents. This was a carefully constructed system, honed over years to capture, kill, and consume travelers without arousing suspicion. The kitchen told an equally terrifying story. Meat grinders, cutting blocks, and large pots bore traces of human blood and tissue. Scientists and investigators examined these items meticulously, documenting evidence that Susan's sausages contained a mixture of pork and human flesh. The realization was nearly incomprehensible. A product praised for its quality and widely consumed throughout the region was in fact a vehicle for cannibalism. Every bite, every shared meal, unknowingly implicated hundreds of innocent people in consuming human flesh. The horror of this discovery sent a collective shiver through everyone present. Interrogations began immediately. Walton, confronted with evidence, initially denied all wrongdoing. He claimed self-defense, isolated incidents, mistakes, and misjudgments. Yet the number of victims, the meticulous records, and the physical evidence made these claims impossible to sustain. Susan, when questioned, spoke with an almost clinical coldness. She described in detail her preferences for human meat, the distinctions in flavor based on age and physical condition, and even the ways she prepared and seasoned it for maximum palatability. Her pride in her culinary expertise was chilling. She treated murder as a recipe, people as ingredients, and death as a necessary step in food preparation. Both kept detailed records of their victims, Walton noting characteristics that made certain travelers ideal targets, and Susan meticulously documenting age, health, emotional state, and even dietary habits. Together, they had created a classification system, determining the best methods of killing, processing, and ultimately consuming human meat. They selected victims based on vulnerability, lack of social connections, and the likelihood that their disappearance would go unnoticed. Merchants, solitary travelers, immigrants, and orphans became prey. Their fates preordained once they stepped through the doors of the Harrowgate Inn. Walton's methods were calculated and precise. He used drowsing substances in the brandy he served, ensuring victims were incapacitated without immediate death. Once unconscious, they were taken to the basement, killed with careful blows to the head to minimize blood loss, and prepared for processing. Susan's system allowed her to process meat in ways that would mask the human origin, mixing it with pork and seasoning it to create a product indistinguishable from ordinary sausages. Even the less desirable parts were used, fed to the animals, burned or otherwise disposed of, leaving minimal evidence behind. The investigation continued for days. Excavations around the inn revealed additional human bones carefully buried or hidden to avoid discovery. Personal effects were catalogued, and letters and journals were seized. The enormity of Walton and Susan's operation became painfully clear. They had operated with impunity for nearly a decade, blending deception, hospitality, and gruesome ingenuity. What had begun as a search for my missing brother had grown into an investigation uncovering the darkest extremes of human depravity. By the end of the week, it was undeniable. Harrowgate Inn was not merely a site of suspicious disappearances. It was a machine of murder, carefully designed to hide in plain sight. Walton and Susan had cultivated trust, friendship, and respect in the community, while simultaneously orchestrating a system of death and consumption. The scale of their operation, meticulously planned, methodically executed, and horrifyingly effective, would haunt me and the entire town for years to come. The day the interrogations began, the air in the Harrowgate Inn study felt heavier than usual. Even though the basement horrors had been discovered, the full scope of Walton and Susan's crimes had not yet been revealed, and the tension in the room was palpable. I watched Walton seated stiffly in the wooden chair, his hands clenched on the table, while Susan sat across from him, her posture rigid, lips pressed together. At first, both tried to maintain the facade of civility, but their carefully constructed walls began crumbling under the intense questioning of the officers. Walton was the first to falter. When asked about his role in the disappearances, he initially claimed that he had only acted in self-defense. Isolated incidents where travelers had attempted to rob the inn. A few unfortunate situations, he muttered, avoiding direct eye contact. But it became painfully clear that his version of events did not align with the sheer volume of evidence gathered. Officers placed documents, photographs of the basement, and even fragments of personal items before him. Each piece contradicted his narrative. His composure, once polished, began to unravel. Small tremors in his hands, fleeting glances toward Susan for reassurance, and occasional swallows that betrayed his anxiety, all revealed a man under immense pressure. Susan, in contrast, maintained a disturbingly calm exterior, her expression almost clinical. When questioned about the source of her sausages, she responded with practiced poise, yet the officers quickly pressed her further. "Explain the quantities," one officer demanded, "and how you managed to produce them with only the animals visible in the pens." Susan's voice sharpened and she leaned forward, her eyes narrowing. "All meat comes from here," she insisted, "and my methods are efficient. That is all you need to know." The defiance was palpable, but the pauses in her speech betrayed that she had no satisfactory answer to the undeniable quantities of meat found on the property. As the interrogations progressed, Walton finally admitted that he had indeed killed travelers. At first, he described it as a few isolated incidents, an unfortunate byproduct of self-preservation. But the officers presented him with the overwhelming physical evidence: human bones in the soil, fragments in the basement, and personal belongings carefully catalogued over nearly a decade. Walton's excuses became unsustainable. Each denial was met with counter-evidence, and eventually he broke down, admitting to the systematic nature of their crimes. Susan's revelations were even more disturbing. She spoke of her development of a taste for human flesh with shocking detachment. According to her, human meat offered a more refined flavor than ordinary animal meat, particularly when seasoned and prepared in specific ways. She described the different flavors of various body parts, noting preferences for certain ages, physical conditions, and even the emotional state of the victim at the time of death. It was chilling to hear her speak of people as though they were nothing more than ingredients in a recipe, referring to them by characteristics such as tenderness of muscle or fat composition, completely devoid of moral reflection. Both maintained meticulous records. Walton kept notes on potential victims, travelers who were isolated, with no immediate family connections or in transitional stages of their lives, merchants moving between towns, migrant workers, orphans newly arrived in the region. His selection criteria were precise, ensuring that disappearances would go largely unnoticed. Susan, in turn, maintained a culinary diary, noting the characteristics of each victim and how these affected the meat's final taste. She categorized victims by age, diet, health, and even emotional temperament. The level of premeditation was staggering. This was not a series of crimes committed in a moment of passion or desperation. This was a calculated long-term operation that treated murder as an industrial process. Walton described in detail the methods used to incapacitate his victims. Drowsing substances, carefully measured and added to brandy served during specially prepared dinners, rendered the guests unconscious. Susan insisted that the quality of the meat improved if the victim did not die immediately but was subdued first. Once incapacitated, Walton would transport them to the basement, where the killings were performed with a hammer, targeting the skull to minimize bleeding and ensure the meat remained as intact and usable as possible. The level of cold calculation in his tone sent shivers through everyone present. Susan's processing techniques were equally horrifying. She described the division of the body into parts for various uses: tender cuts reserved for sausage production, tougher parts fed to animals, and scraps burned or otherwise disposed of. She proudly explained how she combined human meat with pork, using seasoning and smoking techniques that masked any distinctive flavor. She treated the entire process with a chef's precision, noting that certain victims produced superior sausages, while others were better suited for other dishes. The utter lack of empathy, replaced entirely with technical pride, made her words almost surreal in their horror. Both Walton and Susan had gone to extraordinary lengths to dispose of evidence. Walton scattered personal belongings miles away from the inn, creating the illusion the travelers had met misfortune elsewhere. Carriages were damaged and abandoned strategically, then rescued by him, further cementing his public image as a helpful, trustworthy innkeeper. Susan kept detailed notes on storage, preservation, and processing, ensuring that no trace of their crimes remained within the inn itself. Bones were burned in a specially constructed furnace, ashes mixed with manure, and spread across the fields. Everything had been meticulously planned. The psychological horror deepened when Susan revealed that she had kept trophies, jewelry, personal objects, and even letters from victims she considered valuable or aesthetically pleasing. Walton, for his part, had retained identification papers, letters, and mementos, each serving as a record of the people they had murdered. These trophies were not casual souvenirs, but integral parts of the meticulous documentation of their crimes. Each item told a story of death, meticulously catalogued, and preserved for reference in their culinary operations. What emerged from the interrogations was a portrait of a criminal partnership defined by calculation and mutual reinforcement. Walton's sadistic pleasure derived from observing unsuspecting guests, prolonging their last moments, hearing their hopes and dreams, and knowing these would never come to fruition. Susan's pride was rooted in culinary mastery, in the ability to transform human flesh into a delicacy, while documenting the results with almost academic rigor. Together, they had operated an assembly line of death disguised as hospitality. The investigations, guided by the testimonies of Walton and Susan, allowed the officers to reconstruct the scale of their operation. At least 27 people had been murdered at the inn over a span of 9 years, though the true number may have been higher due to travelers who were unreported as missing. Families, children, merchants, and migrants were systematically targeted, their belongings hidden or disposed of to erase traces. The realization that these were not random crimes, but a coordinated, long-term operation, sent shockwaves through everyone involved. Even more disturbing was the knowledge that hundreds of people had unknowingly consumed human flesh. Susan's sausages had been distributed widely, praised for quality, and served at family gatherings, weddings, and community events. Each bite unknowingly implicated the consumers in an act of cannibalism. The collective psychological impact on the community was profound. Families experienced nausea, nightmares, and lasting trauma. The violation of trust, the very assumption that food offered with hospitality is safe, was foundational to the horror. Through the interrogations, it became clear that Walton and Susan had operated with impunity, not only because of careful planning, but because of the community's willingness to overlook anomalies. Strange odors, the behavior of animals, and unusual disappearances were rationalized or ignored. The Harrowgate case became a grim lesson in how appearances, when carefully curated, could hide unimaginable evil. It was a case that forced us all to confront the uncomfortable truth. Even in seemingly safe environments, the worst crimes can occur behind the facade of normalcy. By the end of the third day of interrogation, the officers had compiled an exhaustive record of the Harrowgate operations. Walton and Susan had revealed their system in full: the selection of victims, methods of incapacitation, killing, processing, storage, distribution, and even documentation. Every aspect of their operation demonstrated intelligence, premeditation, and a chilling lack of moral constraint. It was a methodical machine of death that had thrived for nearly a decade, hidden behind the welcoming smile of hospitality. When the trial of Walton and Susan Harrogate began, the atmosphere in the courthouse was unlike anything I had ever witnessed. Journalists from surrounding towns crowded the benches, scribbling furiously, while curious townspeople pressed against every available window and doorway. Inside, the air was heavy with anticipation, fear, and disbelief. People whispered about what they had seen in the newspapers, but the sheer scale of the atrocities promised to unfold during the trial still shocked everyone. Families came forward, some trembling with grief, others trying to steel themselves to hear the details of what had been done to their loved ones. As I sat among the observers, I could feel the tension pressing in from every side. The case had already unsettled the region, but now it would become a public reckoning of unspeakable acts. From the very start, Walton and Susan maintained their distinct personas. Walton appeared nervous, his hands shaking as he held documents and evidence presented by the prosecution. He avoided eye contact, sometimes glancing at Susan as if seeking reassurance or guidance. Susan, in contrast, remained cold, almost impervious to the mounting evidence. She sat with perfect posture, hands folded neatly in her lap, eyes scanning the courtroom as though it were a stage for her performance. It was a chilling contrast. The man cracking under the weight of exposure and the woman unnervingly composed despite the damning proof arrayed against them. The prosecution began by laying out the evidence found at Harrowgate Inn. Photographs of the basement with its hidden compartments and stashed belongings were displayed to the jury. Items included personal effects, clothing, letters, jewelry, money, and toys, each representing a life stolen. Officers recounted the discovery of human bones, fragments partially gnawed, scattered in the soil around the property, some buried deep and others deliberately hidden. The graphic descriptions left several people in the courtroom gasping, others turning their heads away, and yet all remained glued to the proceedings, unable to disengage from the story unfolding before them. Susan's sausages became a central focus of the trial. Witnesses described consuming the products for years, praising the quality, and serving them at family gatherings without any inkling of the horrific truth. Some families wept openly as they realized they had unknowingly eaten human flesh. Others were paralyzed with disbelief, struggling to reconcile the Harrogates' friendly, generous facade with the grotesque reality now revealed. The jury, the public, and the press all seemed to sense the gravity of the betrayal. Not merely a crime of murder, but a profound violation of trust and morality. People who had believed in the basic sanctity of food and hospitality now confronted the shocking evidence that these were the very channels through which monstrous acts had been executed. Walton's testimony was harrowing. Under direct questioning, He described in chilling detail how he and Susan selected their victims. They favored travelers who were alone, those with no immediate family, and people whose disappearance would be delayed in discovery. He admitted to monitoring travelers carefully, noting clothing quality, possessions, and social circumstances to determine their suitability. The process, he explained matter-of-factly, ensured that any disappearance would appear as a chance misfortune or an accident along the road. His demeanor, oscillating between defensiveness and resignation, revealed a man who had calculated every act with precision, fully aware of the consequences. Susan's testimony was even more unsettling. She described with unsettling pride how she had learned to appreciate human flesh as a culinary ingredient. She spoke of taste, texture, and preparation with clinical precision, outlining how she mixed human meat with pork to produce sausages that were superior to conventional products. She detailed her methods for storing, preserving, and seasoning, all while referring to her victims as if they were nothing more than ingredients. Her calmness, combined with the meticulous technical explanations, horrified the courtroom. It was a cold, unfeeling brilliance applied to acts of unparalleled cruelty. The court heard accounts of the couple's premeditation. Walton had developed ways to scatter evidence, planting belongings miles from the inn, and even creating staged incidents like damaged carriages to maintain a public image of helpfulness and concern. Susan kept a diary cataloging every victim, noting age, physical condition, diet, and emotional state, categorizing them by taste and culinary quality. Together, their methods demonstrated a sophisticated understanding of human behavior, crime, concealment, and culinary art, all entwined with deadly precision. The level of planning was staggering, leaving little doubt that these were not acts of impulse, but the product of years of careful orchestration. When the prosecution brought forward the letters and mementos the Harrogates had retained, the courtroom fell silent. Letters from victims, jewelry, personal objects, and identification papers, all trophies from the horrors they had committed, painted a vivid picture of meticulous record-keeping. Susan's letters to loyal customers, previously thought innocuous, were revealed as coded communications about her human ingredients. Every document reinforced the cold, calculated nature of their crimes and made it impossible for the defense to argue that they were occasional, irrational acts. Defense attempts centered on claims of insanity. Psychiatrists examined both Walton and Susan, but concluded they were fully aware of their actions, competent, and capable of understanding the criminal nature of their deeds. Susan's detailed preparation of victims, meticulous record-keeping, and interactions with customers all pointed to conscious awareness. Walton's careful selection of targets, strategic disposal of evidence, and manipulation of public perception confirmed premeditation. The defense could not counter the overwhelming documentation and the sheer consistency of method in the crimes. Witness testimonies added further weight to the prosecution's case. Former customers recounted how highly they praised Susan's sausages, some describing them as the best they had ever tasted. Local families testified about celebrations where the products were served, unaware of the sinister truth. Some neighbors admitted they had noticed oddities over the years, strange odors, unusual behavior of animals, or sudden absences of travelers, but had dismissed them as trivial or unworthy of attention. These accounts underscored the disturbing reality that appearances can conceal the most horrific truths, and that society often rationalizes anomalies until confronted with undeniable evidence. Throughout the proceedings, the public reaction was a mix of horror, disbelief, and outrage. Parents clutched their children, some crying, others shaking with anger. Elderly residents whispered about having eaten the sausages themselves, expressing disbelief and shame. The press captured every detail, sensationalizing the case, but also documenting the profound psychological impact on the community. The realization that human flesh had been unknowingly consumed by hundreds of people created a collective trauma that would linger for generations. Even as the trial progressed, more revelations emerged. The extent of the Harrogates' network, Walton's manipulation of local farmers, and Susan's attempts to share her culinary techniques with other establishments painted a picture of a couple operating a sophisticated, far-reaching operation. It was clear that, had they not been discovered, the Harrogates could have continued for years, perhaps spreading their methods beyond the immediate region. The case became not just a trial of murder. but an exposure of calculated, cold-blooded industry and the vulnerability of trust within a community. As the trial reached its conclusion, the evidence was indisputable. The combination of physical evidence, personal records, witness testimony, and confessions left the jury no choice. Walton and Susan Harrogate had systematically murdered at least 27 individuals, processed their remains into consumable products, and manipulated public perception for nearly a decade. The crimes violated not only the victims but the entire community, destroying the implicit trust inherent in hospitality. The case became a historical benchmark for the study of calculated human evil and the ways in which it can hide behind ordinary appearances. The day of the verdict arrived with a tension that seemed to seep into the walls of the courthouse. I had never witnessed a courtroom so charged with a collective sense of dread and anticipation. The town had gathered not just for justice, but to bear witness to a horror that had infiltrated their very homes, meals, and sense of safety. Families, some still grieving, pressed into the benches. Journalists from neighboring cities filled every corner, notebook pens poised. Even outside, a restless crowd murmured, eager for news, their voices carrying a mixture of fear and indignation. The atmosphere was electric, yet suffused with an undercurrent of grief and disbelief. The people knew that today was not merely a legal proceeding. It was the reckoning of evil that had masqueraded as hospitality for nearly a decade. When the judge entered, silence fell. His presence was commanding, yet the weight of the proceedings seemed to rest on his shoulders as much as on the accused. Walton and Susan Harrogate were brought into the courtroom, their hands shackled, expressions frozen, a chilling tableau. Walton appeared weary and defeated, his shoulders hunched, eyes avoiding the crowd. He had grown thinner since his arrest, the nervous tension from interrogation having taken its toll. Susan, in contrast, retained her eerie composure. She sat tall, chin raised, eyes scanning the room, an unsettling calm radiating from her as though the trial was a performance in which she remained in control. I remember thinking, at that moment, that her composure was not merely pride, but a stark absence of conscience, a chilling reflection of the cold rationality that had guided her every act. The prosecution summarized the evidence one final time before the jury retired. They methodically recounted the discovery of human bones buried and hidden around the inn, the trove of personal belongings, the detailed victim diaries, and the adulterated sausages that had unknowingly passed through the community for years. Walton's confessions, Susan's culinary descriptions of human flesh, the coded letters to customers, all formed a damning narrative that left little room for doubt. The judge's voice, measured and precise, outlined the calculated premeditation, the deceptive hospitality, and the grotesque betrayal of human trust. The courtroom held its collective breath, awaiting the moment when justice would finally pronounce itself. When the jury returned, the foreman rose to deliver the verdict. "Guilty on all counts," he declared, his voice steady but heavy with the gravity of the statement. A hush fell over the room. The word resonated beyond the walls of the courthouse, into the homes, inns, and fields where ordinary people had unknowingly participated in the Harrogate's crimes by consuming their products. For a moment, I felt the enormity of the community's shared trauma crystallize in that single word, guilty. Walton's head fell forward, and I could see the despair etched into every line of his face. Susan, however, lifted her chin and allowed a faint, almost imperceptible smile to cross her lips, as though the verdict confirmed the significance of her actions rather than condemning them. The sentencing phase followed swiftly. The judge, addressing the court and the accused, pronounced the gravity of their crimes with unwavering authority. The offenses committed by Walton and Susan Harrogate represent an affront to all principles of humanity and civilization, he said, his voice echoing through the hall. The systematic murder of innocent travelers, the processing of human remains, and the deceitful sale of those products to our community are acts of such exceptional depravity that the law must respond with the utmost severity. Both Walton and Susan were sentenced to death, reflecting not only the horror of their deeds, but also the enduring impact on the community's trust, morale, and psychological well-being. What followed in the days after the verdict was almost as shocking as the trial itself. Walton, it turned out, would never face the official execution. In November of 1879, just weeks after the sentencing, he was attacked in his cell by fellow prisoners who had learned of the nature of his crimes. The accounts describe a prolonged and brutal beating, resulting in a death so violent it seemed to reflect the collective revulsion even hardened criminals felt toward him. Authorities reportedly made little effort to investigate his death, considering it a form of poetic justice. For the community, this extrajudicial punishment offered a grim satisfaction, though it also underscored the unrelenting horror of the Harrogates' legacy. Susan, on the other hand, faced the gallows. She was executed by hanging in December 1879, one of the very few women to meet such a fate in Pennsylvania during the 19th century. Her final days were marked by the same chilling composure she had maintained throughout the trial. Even as the noose was prepared, she reportedly discussed her seasoning methods for sausages, a final display of defiance that confounded observers and solidified her notoriety. When the trapdoor fell, some say she faced death with an almost ritualistic sense of pride, cementing her place in history not merely as a murderer, but as a personification of calculated cruelty. The fate of Harrowgate in itself reflected the community's desire to erase the site of horror. Within weeks of the trial, the building was demolished, burned completely, and the ashes scattered. The property remained empty for decades, a silent reminder of what had transpired there. Reports from workers and occasional visitors told of a lingering sense of unease. Tools disappearing, inexplicable sensations of being watched, and an oppressive heaviness that seemed to settle over the site. The land was eventually covered with lime and fresh soil, in an effort to purify the contaminated grounds and symbolically restore some measure of dignity for the victims. All the property's animals were slaughtered and burned, as no one dared to consume livestock that had been fed human remains. The breeding areas were excavated thoroughly, uncovering additional human bone fragments that were interred in a local cemetery with religious ceremonies. Families who had lost loved ones had to confront not only the violent deaths, but also the added horror that parts of their family members had been consumed. The psychological toll was immense. Many families chose to relocate entirely, unable to remain in a community forever tainted by betrayal, murder, and cannibalism. The Harrogate case had long-reaching consequences for the local and industry. Travelers became intensely cautious about where they would spend the night. Inns that had previously been trusted suddenly faced suspicion, and legitimate proprietors suffered losses due to the community's eroded confidence. New regulations were enacted requiring meticulous guest records and routine inspections, measures aimed at preventing such a tragedy from happening again. Additionally, law enforcement procedures for missing persons were formalized, with improved communication between jurisdictions to detect patterns of disappearance more effectively. The Harrogates' crimes thus reshaped not just local perception, but also the structural approach to travel safety and criminal investigation. Even decades later, the story continued to haunt the region. Generations of children grew up with cautionary tales of the Harrogates, learning to be wary of strangers and the facades of kindness. Researchers later discovered similar cases elsewhere in the country, revealing that inns functioning as death traps were not entirely unique. The Harrogate case became a model for both criminal investigation and preventive measures in the hospitality industry. Literature and popular culture also drew on the story, creating works of horror that reflected society's fascination and revulsion at the intersection of normalcy and unimaginable evil. Perhaps most haunting was the lingering psychological impact. Residents who had unknowingly consumed Susan's sausages developed deep aversions to processed meat, a culinary phobia that endured for generations. Trust within the community had been fundamentally broken. Even long after the physical evidence had been removed, the memory of the Harrogates' deception and cruelty persisted, a cautionary tale of how evil can masquerade as ordinary benevolence. The deaths of Walton and Susan did not erase the trauma, but they did provide a sense of closure. The inn, the property, and the surrounding area became memorials to the victims, ensuring that the horrors would not be forgotten. Families could finally bury what remained of their loved ones and attempt to rebuild lives that had been shattered. The story of Harrowgate Inn, however, remained embedded in the community psyche, a testament to the depths of human depravity and the consequences of misplaced trust. Even decades after the fall of Harrowgate Inn, its shadow lingered over the region like a persistent chill that refused to dissipate. Walking through the streets of the town, I could still feel the echoes of fear that had permeated every home. every tavern, and every marketplace. Older residents whispered in hushed tones about the horrors that had occurred, and children grew up hearing warnings about strangers and unfamiliar inns. The story of Walton and Susan Harrogate had become more than a criminal case. It was a moral lesson, a cautionary tale, and a part of the local folklore that shaped generations. People spoke of it in the same breath as natural disasters and historical tragedies, as if the evil that had unfolded at Harrowgate Inn was a force unto itself, capable of haunting the living long after the perpetrators were gone. The psychological imprint on the community was undeniable. Even families who had not directly suffered losses experienced profound unease whenever processed meat or sausages were mentioned. Many residents developed what could only be described as culinary phobias. Parents would refuse to serve ground meat or pork products, and children were warned against the dangers of consuming food prepared by strangers. In homes where Susan Harrogate's sausages had once been enjoyed, a lingering sense of guilt persisted. People recounted that even the aroma of smoked meat brought memories of horror, causing nausea, anxiety, and in some cases nightmares. I spoke to a woman whose family had unknowingly served her special sausages at a wedding decades earlier. She admitted that the recollection of that meal still haunted her dreams. The notion that ordinary domestic life had been intertwined with unimaginable evil created a collective trauma that persisted across generations. Local folklore absorbed the Harrogate story, transforming it into legends that blurred the lines between history and myth. Parents told their children tales of the Inn of the Shadows, warning that not all smiles and kind hospitality could be trusted. Travelers passing through Pennsylvania were cautioned to remain vigilant, and every inn in the region seemed to be measured against the dark standards set by the Harrogates. Some stories embellished the horrors. Children disappeared into basements, cries echoed from the walls, and supernatural elements were interwoven with the factual crimes. Yet even the myths retained the essence of truth, the warning that human trust could be weaponized by those hiding behind a facade of normalcy. As I explored these narratives, I realized that the Harrogate case had achieved a kind of immortality, existing not only in court records, but in the collective conscience of a community determined never to forget. Beyond the folklore, the Harrogate case significantly influenced the development of forensic science and investigative procedures. The need to distinguish human remains from animal bones led investigators to develop more sophisticated techniques for bone analysis. Anthropologists, medical examiners, and law enforcement officers studied the remains recovered from the inn and surrounding areas, refining methods to determine the origin, age, and treatment of skeletal fragments. This case became a landmark study in the emerging field of forensic anthropology. I remember speaking to one early investigator who explained that prior to the Harrogate case, there was little systematic methodology for identifying mixed human and animal remains. The complexity of Susan's operation, with bones fed to livestock and ashes scattered across fields, forced authorities to innovate. These techniques would later serve as foundational tools in other complex investigations involving multiple victims and concealment strategies. The Harrogate story also left a permanent mark on travel safety practices and the hospitality industry. Merchants, itinerant workers, and travelers demanded improved communication and safeguards when journeying through isolated areas. Merchant associations created networks to track the movement of members, ensuring that if one disappeared, alerts could be sent quickly across towns and jurisdictions. Inns and lodging establishments were subjected to stricter regulations. Guest registries were meticulously maintained, inspections became routine, and local authorities increased oversight of isolated properties. What began as a community horror evolved into a structural shift that improved safety and accountability in an industry previously vulnerable to exploitation. The irony of this improvement was bitter. The worst kind of lessons, it seemed, are learned through unimaginable tragedy. The cultural reverberations of Harrogate extended into literature, journalism, and entertainment. Writers of the era seized upon the case as inspiration, using its details to craft tales of horror that examined human depravity and the fragility of social trust. Newspapers across Pennsylvania and neighboring states covered the trial extensively, sensationalizing Susan's cold demeanor, Walton's meticulous planning and the surreal betrayal of hospitality. The narrative of seemingly ordinary individuals orchestrating calculated murder captivated the public imagination, shaping perceptions of evil as something that could hide behind civility and charm. As I reviewed the newspapers from the period, I noticed how the case became a reference point, not just for horror stories, but for moral essays on the consequences of naivety and misplaced trust. The Harrogate story served as both entertainment and social warning, embedding itself into the cultural consciousness. Interestingly, the case also revealed the troubling possibility of influence beyond the immediate region. Investigators later discovered attempts by Susan to correspond with other culinary establishments, sharing techniques that, while ostensibly about seasoning, carried the sinister undertone of her human meat processing methods. Fortunately, these exchanges did not result in replication elsewhere, but they underscored the potential for evil practices to spread through knowledge and networks. This insight prompted law enforcement to be cautious about which investigative details were publicly disclosed, balancing the need for transparency with the risk of inadvertently instructing potential copycats. It was a sobering lesson. While the Harrogates' crimes were confined geographically, their methods had a conceptual reach that could have endangered other communities had they not been interrupted. I also observed the case's role in shaping societal responses to unusual or suspicious behaviors. Neighbors who had ignored anomalies, strange odors, the unnatural behavior of animals, the absence of regular guests, were scrutinized in hindsight for their inaction. The community's tendency to rationalize or dismiss suspicious signs revealed how appearances can mask true danger. Walton and Susan had relied on this collective complacency, exploiting the town's trust to operate undetected for nearly 10 years. The Harrogate case thus became a study not only of criminal ingenuity, but also of social psychology, how ordinary people can be blind to extraordinary evil when it is carefully concealed within normality. As I visited the site decades later, now transformed into a simple memorial, I could still feel the weight of history pressing down. The plaque commemorated the victims, naming those identified and acknowledging the unidentified, offering a symbolic act of remembrance and justice. The soil, once enriched with human remains and ashes, had been purified, yet the air seemed heavy with memory. Walking among the modest markers, I reflected on the enduring impact of the Harrogates' crimes, not just the immediate horror, but the long-lasting psychological, cultural, and procedural consequences. Every detail, from the bones in the breeding area to the letters Susan had kept, served as evidence of how evil can permeate a community unnoticed, and how recovery requires both remembrance and structural vigilance. Ultimately, the Harrogate Inn case forced society to confront uncomfortable truths about trust, morality, and vigilance. It illustrated that evil can be methodical, patient, and disguised as ordinary benevolence. The story warned generations to question appearances, to investigate anomalies, and to ensure that social systems prevent the concentration of unchecked power in seemingly ordinary hands. Its legacy extended beyond horror and tragedy. It became a blueprint for law enforcement, a reference for social caution, and a haunting lesson in human psychology. For those of us who studied it, documented it, and preserved its memory, Harrowgate Inn stands as a chilling reminder that the capacity for cruelty exists in places we least expect, and that vigilance, curiosity, and moral courage are essential defenses against it. Even today, as I recount the story, I am struck by the profound lessons it offers. The Harrogate case is more than a tale of cannibalism or murder. It is a story about human nature, societal oversight, and the fragility of trust. It reminds us that even the most civilized communities can harbor dark secrets, and that true safety requires constant awareness and communal responsibility. Generations who came after the trial learned to approach both hospitality and strangers with caution, to question inconsistencies, and to prioritize systems over assumptions. And while the physical evidence has long since been removed, the psychological and cultural imprint remains indelible, a testament to the enduring power of history, memory, and the human capacity to both conceal and reveal truth. As I stood on the site where Harrowgate Inn had once loomed, a sense of solemnity washed over me. The building had been long demolished, reduced to ashes scattered across the land, and yet the echoes of its horrors remained palpable. Walking the grounds, I could feel the weight of nearly a decade of terror, carefully orchestrated by Walton and Susan Harrogate. The empty soil, covered now with lime and fresh earth, was meant to purify the land, but no amount of cleansing could erase the memory of those lives lost, the innocence stolen, or the trust betrayed. I thought of the victims: merchants, artisans, immigrant families, war orphans, and countless travelers who had vanished within those walls. Each had left behind not just personal belongings, but stories, dreams, and loved ones forever haunted by absence. The inn, a supposed sanctuary of hospitality, had become a place of unimaginable evil. The memorial erected on the site offered a modest tribute to the victims, a plaque listing the names of those identified and acknowledging the unknown. I ran my fingers lightly over the inscription, feeling a chilling connection to the lives that had been cut short. It struck me how important remembrance is, not only to honor the dead, but also to ensure that history's darkest chapters remain visible, instructive, and impossible to ignore. Families who had lost loved ones, already traumatized by the revelation that their relatives had been consumed, now had at least a small measure of recognition and closure. Yet the emotional scars lingered, and I knew that some grief could never be fully healed. I spoke with descendants of victims, many of whom had moved away from Pennsylvania, unwilling to live near the site of such horrors. Their stories were laden with both sorrow and a quiet determination to ensure that the Harrogate tragedy would never be forgotten. Simon Brennan's role in unraveling the Harrogate operation remained one of the most inspiring aspects of the case. His relentless pursuit of truth after the disappearance of his brother Cornelius had been the catalyst for exposing nearly a decade of murder and cannibalism. I could imagine his anguish, the sleepless nights, the agonizing uncertainty, and the personal torment that drove him to question every convenient explanation offered by Walton and Susan. It was his persistence that led investigators to search the inn's basement, uncover the chest of personal belongings, and eventually discover the human bones in the breeding area. Simon's courage and unwillingness to accept easy answers exemplified the critical role of individual determination in confronting evil. Without his dogged inquiry, the Harrogates might have continued their operation, claiming countless additional victims before the law finally intervened. I spoke to historians who emphasized that Simon's actions serve as a timeless lesson. Vigilance, persistence, and moral courage are vital tools against injustice. The trial itself left a deep imprint on legal and societal frameworks. The proceedings were notorious, attracting journalists from neighboring cities and drawing intense public attention. Susan's defiance and complete lack of remorse shocked observers, while Walton's calculated admissions revealed a chillingly methodical criminal mind. The prosecution meticulously documented the couple's actions, demonstrating premeditation, scientific categorization of victims, and systematic disposal of evidence. Psychiatrists of the era determined that both were mentally competent, fully aware of the criminal nature of their deeds. The verdict was unanimous and swift. Both were sentenced to death. Walton met his end at the hands of fellow prisoners before official execution could be carried out, a violent testament to the horror he inspired even among criminals. Susan was hanged, maintaining her defiant pride until her last moments, allegedly reciting a sausage recipe as a final act of rebellion. These events cemented the Harrogate case as one of the most infamous in Pennsylvania history, and it became a reference point in criminal justice for decades. The aftermath of the trial forced the community to confront the long-reaching consequences of the crimes. Residents experienced collective trauma. The knowledge that they had unknowingly consumed human flesh produced lasting psychological effects. Families reported persistent nausea, food aversions, and recurring nightmares. Many abandoned the consumption of processed meat entirely, while local meat producers faced significant economic decline due to eroded trust. Travel practices shifted, with merchants and itinerant workers demanding greater accountability from inns and lodging establishments. Guest registries, inspections, and communication networks were strengthened to prevent similar tragedies. The Harrogate case thus acted as a catalyst for social and regulatory reform, demonstrating how horrific events can lead to meaningful structural change when lessons are heeded. Stories of Harrogate Inn permeated literature, folklore, and public consciousness. Writers and journalists drew inspiration from the events, creating horror stories, moral essays, and investigative chronicles that explored both the mechanics of the crimes and the psychology of those involved. In taverns, classrooms, and homes, the tale of the Harrogates served as both a gripping narrative and a cautionary lesson. It reinforced the importance of vigilance, the dangers of misplaced trust, and the need to question appearances, particularly when something seems too convenient, too kind, or too ordinary. The Harrogate story had transcended its geographic origins, becoming a symbol of hidden evil and the necessity of societal awareness. Even decades later, the site of the inn retained a sense of unease. Workers and visitors reported inexplicable phenomena. Tools disappearing, a sensation of being watched, and a pervasive chill in the air. While some dismissed these experiences as imagination or superstition, I considered them echoes of memory, a lingering imprint of human suffering that no physical cleanup could erase. These occurrences reinforced the notion that places of extreme horror leave psychological traces, influencing those who encounter them and warning future generations of the potential for danger in familiar settings. Memorialization became an essential act of community healing. Annual ceremonies honored the victims, offering prayers, flowers, and moments of silence. The descendants of the murdered families participated whenever possible, acknowledging both the tragedy and the resilience of those left behind. These gatherings provided a forum to discuss the broader lessons of the Harrogate case, the importance of vigilance, the value of moral courage, and the necessity of fostering systems that prevent concentrated abuses of trust. I attended one such ceremony, noting the somber faces, the whispered prayers, and the palpable collective memory that united the community despite decades of time and distance. In reflecting on the Harrogate case, I am struck by the multifaceted legacy it left behind. Beyond the immediate horror of cannibalism and murder, it reshaped law enforcement practices, spurred advancements in forensic science, altered societal attitudes toward travel and hospitality, and became a permanent fixture in cultural memory. It also forced hard questions about human psychology. How can evil hide in plain sight? Why do communities sometimes rationalize anomalies? And what responsibilities do individuals bear when confronted with signs of wrongdoing? These questions remain relevant, even today, underscoring the enduring significance of the Harrogate story. Ultimately, the story of Harrowgate Inn is a testament to the human capacity for both evil and courage. Walton and Susan Harrogate demonstrated how cruelty can be methodical, patient, and hidden behind ordinary appearances. Simon Brennan exemplified the moral courage required to uncover such evil and seek justice. The community's trauma highlighted the deep, lasting effects of betrayal and deception, while subsequent reforms illustrated the importance of vigilance and systemic safeguards. Walking away from the memorial, I felt both the weight of history and the imperative to remember. The story endures not only as a record of horror, but as a lesson in trust, vigilance, and the resilience of the human spirit. For anyone exploring the darker corners of history, the Harrogate case serves as a stark reminder. Evil can disguise itself in the mundane, and ordinary people can unwittingly become part of unimaginable crimes. Yet, through persistence, investigation, and moral courage, justice can prevail and communities can heal. The memory of Harrowgate Inn, its victims, and the extraordinary investigation that exposed its horrors will continue to instruct, caution, and haunt future generations. And as I recount this story, I am reminded that history is not merely a record of events, but a living testament to the lessons humanity must never forget. Even now, as I close my notebook and leave the memorial grounds behind, the story lingers in my mind. Harrowgate Inn may be gone, but its lessons remain alive. It is a caution, a warning, and an enduring chapter in the collective consciousness of a community forever marked by horror. True safety, I realized, is built not only on vigilance but on systems awareness and the courage to confront uncomfortable truths. And it is in remembering, documenting, and reflecting upon such events that we honor the victims and protect the living.